Hello everyone, it's Jen back here again. I hope we're all doing well. So for this particular video, I wanted to put out a particular proposition that I have been mulling over for a little bit of time now. And that proposition is the MBTI fundamentally an archetypal framework of personality? Now, as we all know, the MBTI has certainly grown over the past few years. Pop psychology loves the Myers Briggs now. But as its following gets increasingly large, so does its reputation for being a pseudoscience. It has become so trivialized and commercialized now, to the point where people are relating it more to astrology than psychology itself. Now, we have to kind of think about why that is. First of all, let's just take a few steps back and remember where the MBTI or psychology types came from. And that was Carl Jung. We shouldn't discredit Jung for all of his formulation of psychological types. The cognitive functions, not to mention the terms introversion and extroversion, have been such an original, sophisticated, and insightful way of conceptualizing the human personality that we are still using these terms now. The words introvert and extrovert are actually embedded into our everyday language because its impact is so powerful. So, due to this so-called psychological background of MBTI from Carl Jung, people tend to attribute more credibility to the framework, even though the majority of people who follow the MBTI never actually familiarize themselves with Jung, or simply regard the MBTI as another form of, say, astrology. And that's one of the greatest criticisms of it, is that if it's a pseudoscience, and you're just basing your personality off of these descriptions, it's no different from, say, something like astrology. So it's not like the MBTI is the only personality theory out there. In fact, the Big Five is much more empirically based and well known in the scientific community for being the closest to what we have to defining and categorizing personality. So there's been heaps of tests, heaps of research that is dedicated to the Big Five. But why doesn't the Big Five have the same ring or influence as the MBTI? And why does a framework like astrology have such a lasting impact on how people view themselves and each other, even though there is no empirical basis for it, and it seems like it's such an old framework that should be dying out, but it's still around? My answer to that, which also happens to be a question, is the MBTI or psychological types fundamentally an archetypal framework of personality? So anyone with at least a surface knowledge of Jungian psychology will know of his theory of archetypes in the collective unconscious. Birthed from ancestral knowledge, archetypes are the universal symbols or symbolic representations of human nature, often manifesting themselves as characters or personalities. They exist within the collective unconscious of humanity to predispose us to the possibility of generating or embodying these archetypes in our own personalities. My question is, or my theory is, that does this pre-existing Jungian notion of archetypes then supposedly suggest that psychological types also follows an archetypal formulation, or this essence behind it, behind all of the rationale of the theory and so on, right? Although Jung categorizes people into various cognitive functions, he nonetheless emphasizes the dualistic and interactive nature of the functions into creating a whole or balanced personality. The conscious function must coexist with an unconscious function, for example, and the resulting personality type is precisely that, a mere representation of the general character of a person, or an archetype. The personality type isn't synonymous with the individual. The type isn't the same thing as the entirety of what this person is, because we have to take into account like social, environmental factors, developmental factors, and all of that, race, gender, etc. But describes the bounded psychic environment in which the individual can develop his or her potential. So, when relating to archetypes, Jung is merely pointing out the fundamental differences that can exist between or within human personality. Archetypes can be seen as images or forms of the types of people we may identify with in life. Types change, although they rarely do, just as people rarely change on the fundamental level. Hypothetically, let's say we have someone who types themselves as an INFJ, but 10 years later, or for some of us it could just be a few months later, they take the test again and receive an ISFP. Okay, so what's the deal here? It isn't so much that their type has changed, their personality has changed. It's that they are rediscovering another aspect of themselves that is in development. So the person who initially identified themselves as an INFJ was perhaps in a stage of their lives, in a point in their lives where they felt like a very empathic person. So they identify with this INFJ description. Oh yes, that's really me. But 3 months later, when they start a new job, or they move house, they go traveling, or something happens, and they start identifying themselves with this other character, this other archetype. So they get the result of the ISFP, and the ISFP is known as an adventurer, kind of a free spirit, and maybe this INFJ person has this wonderful revelation after traveling that, I found this side of me that is, that can identify with this adventurer or traveler archetype. Therefore, that person starts identifying more with the ISFP. So it's important that we shouldn't try to deconstruct and pick apart the typology theory itself and make comments in regards to the development of the certain cognitive functions. Otherwise, we lose sight of our potential as human beings to identify with different images and self-images. So there are several issues in the MBTI community that are continuously coming up. One is people continuously getting varying results in MBTI tests, people getting mistyped, people relating to different, MBTI types along the spectrum. A way that we can explain this ongoing phenomena can be that if it is true that MBTI is fundamentally an archetypal personality theory, what drives people to believe in the MBTI isn't the rationale behind the theory itself. It isn't about how perfectly made, how perfectly thought out this theory was to begin with, but the archetype or the archetypes that each type represents. In fact, in Jungian typology, before the MBTI blew up, Jung attributed personalities to the functions themselves. So TE was the extroverted thinker who would always verbalize their thoughts, be the life of the party, and dominate conversations. Okay, so that was Jung's personality archetype, and he had 8 of them. He had 8 personality archetypes that he had to put forward as conscious personalities. And I'm not saying that his 8 types are flawless and superior to the MBTI in any way, but I'm just saying that that original personality theory that was developed from Jung's mind came up with 8. And then you have the MBTI, which has complicated our identification with the primary archetype by including the function stack. Now, the function stack, what it does is that it encourages analysis, right? And because of that, people are often subject to complex analysis over and over again. And what this does is this analysis paralysis, or over-focusing on the details, takes us away from the bigger picture. What the benefit of taking personality typology symbolically is that we are able to take it with a grain of salt rather than taking it literally or scientifically. Because archetypes are symbols of aspects of human nature, such as the hero archetype, the god archetype, the magician archetype, and so on, it's safe to say that we don't only have one archetype within us. Most of us are a combination of archetypes. So they're a combination of aspects or characters within each individual that we can plausibly embody throughout our lifetimes, because we have that underlying framework within us. It's like epigenetics. You know, we have this genetic aspect of ourselves that can flourish into a certain potential given the correct environment. You can have someone say, I'm both INFJ and INFP at the same time because I identify with both. Right. Or you might have someone say, you know, you can't be an INFJ because you're not like me at all, and I'm an INFJ and I know what it's like to be an INFJ. That's fine. But perhaps what you're really having there is two different types of people who identify with different self-images or archetypes. So someone might have a particular image or interpretation or representation of an INFJ, whereas another person has a different representation of an INFJ. An INFJ is often seen as an empath, but they can also be seen as taking on embodying certain characters like Hitler, for example. And someone might say that, you know, if an INFJ can be Hitler, someone might identify with this strong kind of charismatic social reformer INFJ versus the person who identifies with the really empathic, nurturing, motherly INFJ. And that explains why different people have different ideas of the same type, why there are all these theories out there about different subtypes of INFJs, and they never fully encapsulate all the personalities or the possibilities. You can have, say, the 4 main subtypes of INFJs, but there's still people out there who will say, I don't identify with any of them, but I am an INFJ, because they identify with a different archetype. And the idea is that the possible manifestations of an archetype can be vast. In saying all of that, what really is the strength of having a personality theory predicated on archetypes if there's all this confusion around it? Well, let's start with pointing out the obvious flaws, being stereotyping, oversimplification of someone's true personality, and assuming you know someone based on their type. But if you think about it, this only happens when you take the theory literally rather than symbolically. It may be the difference between literal and metaphorical interpretations of the Bible or a religious text. Literal interpretations instigate conflict over minuscule details while missing the bigger picture, while metaphorical interpretations encourage discussion and exploration. I personally think that being able to identify strongly with a MBTI type or a psychological type helps narrow down your search of compatible friends and partners. If you meet someone who supposedly identifies with the same type as you, you don't automatically assume that they are the exact same person as you, or that differences between you and this person either mean either one of you is mistyped, you're different subtypes of the same type, or you're either healthy or unhealthy versions of that same type. What you should be paying attention to is that you two arrived at the same type because you have something in common. And that something in common is usually an identification with the same archetype. Examples of these archetypes that people share may be the empath, commonly associated with an INFJ, or a reserved intellect, an INT type, or the performer, an ESFP, for example. And whatever that thing you have in common should bring you together rather than apart, due to constant evaluation of the accuracy of that person's arrival of their type. So what I'm constantly observing in the MBTI community, based on this preoccupation with accurate typing, regardless of which variation of the personality typology you adhere to. Jungian psychology, there's Jungian typology, there's MBTI, there's Socionics, I went through all of that. And you became rather familiar with all of those different theories that are just slight deviations or variations of cognitive functions or application of the cognitive functions. So what that does, that preoccupation actually deviates you from the identification with the archetype, which is the symbolic nature of your personality or character versus the literal or scientific interpretation of it. And like I said before, if we are truly as humans after that scientific explanation, we should be paying more attention to the big five, but we don't. As humans, we like to identify with images and archetypes and characters because they give us they give us a fuller picture of who we are, because what archetypes tend to do is that they paint a narrative for us to follow. Whereas when you have a personality theory or inventory like the big five, they give us just traits, neuroticism, openness, extroversion, right? But you're never given this full character in which you can project yourself onto, first of all, and look up to as a role model in order to construct a narrative out of the existing narrative around that archetype. So what I said before in regards to an archetype or a psychological type, allowing you this bounded sense of your potential, because if you have too much potential, it gets confusing. It becomes this whole existential search for meaning where it's like, I can be anything, but I can't choose because I don't know. You'd have to keep exploring, right? Whereas I think people are so attracted to astrology or the MBTI or any categorization of personality based on these overarching descriptions of types, is because they give us that meta-narrative to follow in our journey of self-discovery. What I do want everyone to take out of this video isn't to discredit the MBTI, to discredit cognitive functions and all that, because it's a wonderfully original and stimulating intellectual theory and way of conceptualizing personality that hasn't been introduced before. What I want to emphasize is that when we allow any psychological formula to dictate a person's coming to be, then typology itself loses its magnetism. It loses its power, its meaning over us. And most importantly, makes us lose our focus on the person as an individual. When we use these personality typologies and theories, ultimately we don't want to lose touch with our own journey, which is a constantly evolving one. That means we don't want to limit ourselves to this preconceived notion of what we should be, right? We can identify with an archetype or a type and allow that to inform us within these boundaries of what are the best paths to take, versus having all of these paths in the spectrum of all personalities. It gives us this basic understanding of the types of people or characteristics that we identify with, and tells us the possible narratives that we can take. It should be a guide. It should be a guide, but not a formula. So what a guide does is that it narrows our options to the best options for each individual, which actually relieves us from that constant existential pondering. But it doesn't limit us so much as to become blind to our identifications with other archetypes or other types. One of the stories I'd like to share is recently I did this this kind of introspective exercise where I kind of wrote down different characteristics of my personality. And in one of the exercises I got myself to do was to envision this particular image of a person that I wanted to project onto the outside world, that I wanted to adopt. And it was funny because the archetype or the image that came to mind was an ENTJ. When I was using the ENTJ label, I wasn't referring to the ENTJ that has extroverted thinking as their first function, and introverted intuition as their second function, as an introvert feeling as their inferior function. I was referring to the person an ENTJ represents, this strong, assertive, kind of person, this strong figure that represents autonomy and independence. And that was the kind of person that I was trying to aspire towards. And I wasn't trying to deconstruct the personality type itself, but I was looking at the personality type symbolically and as an archetype, and thinking how I can draw inspiration or learn from this particular type of person, because a part of me identifies with that particular person. So that's just a little example of how you can approach personality theories like the MBTI. It doesn't always have to be like, you need to know what the cognitive functions are. You need to know what comes first, the primary, the secondary, the tertiary, that it's a formula. At the end of the day, it's pseudoscience. No one can prove this. No one can prove or disprove astrology, for example. But if you really want to gain the most out of it, I think, interpret it not with a grain of salt. I hear it all the time. Per theories, interpret everything with a grain of salt. Even if it's economic theories that are driving our economies and nations. Sure, we can take any of that with a grain of salt, but in order to apply that theory, we need a certain level of faith in its strengths, a certain level of faith in its ability to benefit us somehow. Because no theory is flawless. With theories like the MBTI, it's better to take it symbolically than literally. So that is all I have for you guys today. A discussion of this is welcome in the comment section. I'm not claiming that I'm an expert at any of this. Okay, at the end of the day, I probably couldn't have created a system like the MBTI. Props to Myers Briggs for formulating the theory, because it's amazing. It's a great theory. But I do hope that this video was able to encourage people in the MBTI community, or anyone who is interested or curious about personality typology, to view it from a different perspective. And I will talk to you guys next time in my next video. Bye.